welcome the anointed ones. If you ever want to see someone's real face, put a will in the middle of the room and watch who starts plotting a funeral while smiling. Let me say this plain and loud. The inheritance wasn't just money, it was war disguised in legal paperwork. Because you, chosen one, weren't just written into a will, you were written into a prophecy. And when you took that seat at the table, you shattered every lie they built to keep you out. Now they're scrambling, not just for lawyers, but for cover. Here's the cold, brutal truth. Over 70% of inheritance disputes never make it about justice. They make it about revenge. But in your case, it's deeper than that. This got spiritual. This got ancestral. This got dangerous. They wanted the assets. You inherited assignments. They had lawyers. You had divine backing. They wrote you off. Now they're writing charges because they can't process the fact that you won without playing dirty. And let's be real. At this point, you're not just the heir. You're the headline. You're the scandal. You're the how the hell did they pull that off whisper in family group chats. So buckle up, because we're about to expose why these criminal charges are loading, how this courtroom win flipped their whole script, and why your clean hands have them shaking like they just saw a ghost in court. This isn't just a legal victory, it's spiritual retribution with a paper trail. Let's get into it. Number 1. They never expected a clean soul would outmaneuver their filthy system. They never thought someone like you could beat them without playing dirty. That's what scares them the most. Not that you won, but how you won. You didn't use manipulation, threats, or under-the-table deals. You stayed calm, precise, and grounded in truth. And that exposed every single one of their tactics. They were banking on chaos. They assumed you'd panic, fold under pressure, or lash out emotionally. That was their entire plan. But you did the one thing they couldn't predict. You kept your integrity intact while walking through fire. They spent months, maybe years, crafting a story to make you look greedy, unfit, unstable, or undeserving. Behind the scenes, they were twisting narratives, forging alliances, and moving in shadows. They thought your silence was weakness. They thought your patience meant you didn't know what they were doing. But you knew. And still, you refused to lower yourself. That's what broke them. Because in their world, everyone's got a price. Everyone can be provoked, baited, or bought. But you weren't motivated by ego or revenge. You just wanted what was rightfully yours, and that made you dangerous. They expected you to fight like them. Instead, you outmaneuvered them by not becoming them. That's the part they can't wrap their heads around. You didn't manipulate the system. You forced the system to see you clearly. And when that clarity came through, so did the cracks in their case. The truth is, you didn't even have to scream or expose anyone in public. All you had to do was stay clean while they got dirty, and the contrast was too loud to ignore. That courtroom became a spotlight, and they couldn't hide from it. Now they're panicking. Now they're angry, because they threw everything at you and it didn't stick. The power you showed wasn't in how loud you spoke. It was in how untouchable your spirit was through it all. You didn't just win. You made a statement. You don't have to lie, steal, or scheme to come out on top. You just have to be able to stand in truth when everyone else is drowning in theirs. That's what really sent them over the edge. That's why the charges are loading. They didn't lose to a criminal. They lost to a clean soul. And that kind of defeat stings forever. Number 2, this wasn't about money. It was about bloodlines, power, and what you represent. This case was never just about a will or some paperwork with dollar signs. That was the surface-level distraction. What was really at stake here was power, bloodlines, and identity. You didn't just walk into a courtroom. You walked into a centuries-old fight for control over legacy. And they were furious the moment they realized someone like you, someone they thought was beneath them, had the audacity to claim what was divinely aligned with your name. They didn't just want to keep the money. They wanted to erase your connection to it. To them, you were never meant to be an heir. You were meant to be forgotten, ignored, treated like a mistake in the family line. But when you stepped up and took legal ground, they knew something deeper had shifted. You weren't just fighting for assets. You were fighting for recognition, for validation, for your place in the bloodline they tried to rewrite without you. There's a reason this got so dark so fast. Because your win didn't just shake a few egos, it threatened a whole structure of lies built over years. You cracked a system that was set up to protect the entitled and exclude the rightful. And that's when they realized this wasn't just a case. It was a spiritual earthquake. Your presence alone forced the truth out of hiding. And suddenly, they weren't dealing with some outsider. They were facing the one who carried the original blueprint. The one who wasn't just connected by name, but by spirit. You represent everything they thought they had buried. Honor, integrity, purpose. They spent years trying to silence that energy in the family line. And here you come walking into court with quiet authority and a clean record. That's what rattled them. That's what turned this into warfare. Your victory was never just legal, it was symbolic. It meant that the people who were meant to inherit power could no longer be silenced by manipulation. It meant the truth in the blood would rise, even if the entire system tried to bury it. You didn't just get an inheritance. You reminded everyone who you are. And that reminder was too loud for them to handle. They didn't lose control of the money. They lost control of the narrative. And that's what really burns. Number 3, your ancestors intervened because you were the first one with clean hands. You weren't just chosen for this inheritance, you were called. And that calling came from way before you were even born. What happened in that courtroom wasn't random. It was the result of generations of prayers, pain, and unfinished spiritual business finally being resolved through you. Your ancestors didn't just leave behind wealth. They left behind battles they couldn't win, truths they couldn't speak, and curses they couldn't break. And whether you realize it or not, you were the first one in the bloodline with clean hands and the strength to finish what they started. That's why this case hit so differently. That's why the attacks were so personal. This wasn't just about legal rights. This was about spiritual alignment. Your ancestors were watching, not just to see if you'd win, but to see if you were strong enough not to become what they spent lifetimes trying to escape. And you were. You didn't sell out. You didn't let bitterness poison your vision. You walked with dignity through a fight that would have broken the people who came before you. You see, in every family there's someone born to stop the cycle. Not just the cycle of abuse or trauma, but the cycle of silence, the cycle of stolen inheritances, hidden truths, and generational betrayal. You were that person. And when you stood your ground, something broke in the spiritual realm. The things that had been circling your family for decades, greed, manipulation, secrecy, started to unravel because you didn't feed into them. You brought light into a space that had been dark for too long. That's why the shift was so intense. That's why the attacks escalated. You weren't just threatening their legal position. You were threatening their spiritual hold on the bloodline. They knew if you won, the curse would lift, the truth would spread, the power would transfer, and it did. This wasn't just about a signature or a court ruling. This was about being the one who finally answered the call. The one your ancestors hoped for but never lived to see. You were the only one with the spiritual clearance to unlock what had been sealed. And now that the seal is broken, nothing will ever be the same. Number 4. They tried to frame you because it was the only way left to regain control. They tried to frame you because, deep down, they knew they'd already lost. When the facts didn't bend in their favor, and the paperwork couldn't be twisted, they went straight for the oldest tactic in the book. Destroy your name. That's the last resort of people who are drowning in their own lies. If they can't beat you fair and square, they'll try to drag your reputation through the mud, hoping you'll sink with it. They weren't after justice, they were after control. And when they realized the system couldn't be manipulated to their advantage anymore, they panicked. Suddenly, anonymous tips started circulating. Documents got misplaced. Stories were twisted. And just like that, the narrative changed. Not because the truth changed, but because they needed a distraction from it. That's what framing is. It's a desperate attempt to change the conversation when the facts don't cooperate. They knew they couldn't erase the evidence that you were the rightful heir. They couldn't reverse the court's decision. So they did the only thing left. They launched a personal attack. Because in their mind, If they can't defeat you in court, they'll try to defeat you in the court of public opinion. If they can't touch your blessing, they'll try to stain your name so badly that people stop seeing your victory as valid. But here's what makes you more dangerous than ever. You already won in truth. You already faced their worst and stayed upright. And now their lies can't stick like they used to. People are watching them scramble. The mask is slipping, and no matter how much dirt they try to throw on you, it's not landing the way they hoped. Because you've got something they'll never understand. Proof in both spirit and law that you didn't just survive their schemes. You beat them at their own game without becoming like them. The real reason they're pressing charges, it's not justice, it's retaliation. Because they thought framing you would silence you. Instead, it confirmed just how clean your spirit really is. And now they're exposed, not just as liars, but as losers in a war they started and couldn't finish. Number 5. The courtroom was never the battlefield, it was the mirror. The courtroom was never the real battlefield. It was the mirror that exposed who everyone truly was when there was nowhere left to hide. People walked in dressed in titles, family roles, and fake concern. But the moment the evidence hit the table and the testimonies started flying, the masks began to crack. This wasn't about legal wins or losses. It was about light hitting shadow. It was about hidden agendas finally being forced into the open. They weren't ready for that kind of exposure. They thought their fake smiles and rehearsed stories would be enough. They thought the family name would protect them. But the courtroom has a way of making everything go silent except for truth. It doesn't care about blood ties or manipulation. It only cares about facts. And when the facts lined up, they didn't point at you. They pointed at them. The lies they whispered in private suddenly looked ridiculous under cross-examination. The stories they made up started collapsing when they were asked one too many questions. What was once a controlled narrative became a pile of contradictions, on record, under oath, and in front of people who matter. That space wasn't your battleground. You'd already won the real war the moment you decided not to stoop to their level. The courtroom was just the confirmation. It didn't make you righteous. It just proved you already were. And more importantly, it showed who was hiding behind the curtain of fake concern, fake apologies, and fake unity. Every phony alliance was exposed. Every neutral relative who suddenly forgot everything. Every friend-turned-stranger who got real quiet when you needed support. It all came out. And while they were watching to see if you'd crumble, the universe used that courtroom like a spotlight. Not to break you, but to reveal them. Not just to you, but to everyone watching. It wasn't a place of justice. It was a place of unveiling. And by the time it was over, the people who tried to bury you were standing fully exposed, uncovered by their own hands, caught by their own schemes, and left with nothing but the image of themselves they never wanted the world to see. Number 6, you didn't win the case. You ended a bloodline curse. You didn't just win a case. You slammed the door shut on a generational curse that had been running wild in your bloodline for years, maybe even centuries. This wasn't just about a will or a piece of land. It was about the unspoken patterns passed down like traditions. Secrecy, betrayal, stolen inheritances, favoritism, and manipulation dressed up as family dynamics. You didn't just say, "I want what's mine." You said, "This ends with me." And that declaration didn't just ruffle feathers, it shook spirits. There are people in your lineage who died without closure, who were written out of histories, who were silenced because they dared to speak the truth. You stood in that courtroom with all of that behind you. Whether you knew it or not, you walked in carrying the weight of those buried voices. And when you refused to play dirty, when you chose honesty over chaos, you broke the pattern they thought would never end. You didn't just represent yourself. You represented every soul who was wronged and forgotten. That's why this win hit so hard. That's why the energy shifted, because spiritually it was never about money. It was about justice being delayed for far too long. And now that justice finally arrived, the darkness that fed off that old system is lashing out. It can't control you, so it's trying to crush you. That's where these fake charges, false accusations, and desperate attacks come from. It's not just them. It's the spiritual residue trying to regain access to what you just shut down. You exposed generational greed. You made manipulation look weak. You didn't run from the dysfunction. You confronted it with grace and truth. And when you did that, you unplugged a cycle that had gone unchecked for ages. That's why they're scrambling. That's why they're accusing. Because the inheritance you claimed wasn't just wealth, it was spiritual authority. You weren't chosen to win for yourself. You were chosen to break something ancient. And now that you have, the darkness knows it's losing ground. The curse is broken. But the backlash, that's the final scream of a power that's been dethroned. Stand firm, because this isn't revenge, it's redemption. Number 7. The will was tampered with because they knew who you would become with power. They didn't tamper with the will out of greed alone. They did it out of fear, deep, primal, ancestral fear, because they knew exactly what would happen if the rightful heir, you, got access to real power. It wasn't just about stopping you from getting money. It was about stopping you from stepping into your full identity, from waking up completely, from ruling what they've only known how to manipulate. You with resources is a threat to everything they've built in the dark. They forged signatures. They hid key pages. They played games with dates and witnesses. And it wasn't just desperation, it was strategy, because they've always known what you carried, even when you didn't. They could feel the shift in the atmosphere when you walked in. They knew your presence wasn't just loud, it was prophetic. Something in them recognized you as the one who would disrupt the entire system they thrived in. And once you got access to legacy, truth, and authority, it was over for them. That's why they tried to erase you from the documents like you never existed. That's why your name accidentally disappeared. That's why they made sure key information was buried, sealed, or conveniently forgotten. Because they knew the will wasn't just a legal file. It was spiritual proof of your right to power. And if that power ever reached your hands, their time in the shadows would be up. Their lies would collapse. Their fake alliances would rot. Because you don't just inherit, you restore. You don't hoard, you expose. They weren't protecting assets. They were protecting a kingdom made of manipulation, favoritism, and generational silence. And one look at you, and they knew you would burn it all down just by walking in truth. Your existence, armed with clarity and access, is the exact storm they've been praying never comes. That's why they tampered with the will. Because deep down, they knew what many are just starting to realize: you are the key. And once that key unlocks the truth, everything they stole, twisted, or corrupted becomes worthless. You, with power, isn't just dangerous, it's their extinction notice. Number 8. You forced a system built on greed to acknowledge purity. You weren't supposed to win. Not because you weren't right, but because the system was never designed for someone like you to come out on top. It rewards the loudest, not the most honest. It protects whoever's already in control. It bends for those who know how to twist it. And you came in with clean hands, clear facts, and a quiet strength that didn't beg, didn't bribe, and didn't back down. That's what made you dangerous. You didn't try to manipulate the system. You forced it to function the way it claims to. And that, right there, is revolutionary. You didn't lie, cheat, or twist anything. You simply showed up with truth. And that truth was so undeniable, so pure, that even the system had to pause and adjust itself. The same machine that usually chews people up had to cough you up and give you what was rightfully yours. You didn't work it. You exposed it. That's what really shook them. Because they've spent years learning how to exploit loopholes, how to bend laws, how to weaponize relationships, money, and influence. And here you came, not as a victim, but as a force, a moral interruption. A walking contradiction to everything they thought guaranteed victory. You were proof that a person rooted in truth doesn't need to manipulate to win. They just need to stand. You forced everyone in that room to deal with what they didn't expect: integrity with evidence. A soul they couldn't bribe, break, or discredit. You didn't just beat the case, you embarrassed the system. You made it prove that purity still has a place, even in a world that tries to bury it. That's why they're mad. That's why they're still trying to get at you. Because they couldn't outwit you, they couldn't outmaneuver you. And most of all, they couldn't corrupt you. You broke the unspoken rule. Only the cunning win. And you flipped it. You won by being real, by staying clean, by forcing a machine built on greed to bow to something it thought no longer existed. Purity with power. Number 9. You were watched the entire trial, not just by people, but by powers. This trial wasn't just a legal battle fought in a courtroom full of people. It was a cosmic event witnessed far beyond human eyes. Every step you took, every word you spoke, was being watched by forces that don't show up on cameras or news reports. There were powers tied to your bloodline, both dark and light, holding their breath, waiting to see if you'd break or stand your ground. The demons that thrived on your family's secrets and pain were lurking, hoping you'd stumble, hoping they could reclaim what they'd lost. But you didn't give them the satisfaction. You held your ground with a strength that wasn't just yours, it was ancestral. It was as if every whispered prayer, every silent tear, every act of defiance from those who came before you fueled your courage. They were watching to see if the chain of submission and silence would continue, or if you'd be the one to shatter it. And by standing firm, you shattered it. You sent a message through dimensions that you are not a pawn. You are not a victim. You are a warrior rewriting the script. Now, the judgment isn't just coming from a judge behind a bench or a jury in the courtroom. It's coming from realms unseen, where the real power lies. The victory you achieved here resonates in the spiritual realm like thunder, shaking the foundations of old curses and exposing hidden truths. Those dark forces who tried to manipulate your fate are being held accountable in ways they never expected. This is why the backlash is so fierce. The fight isn't over in this world because it never was just about this world. Your win has disrupted the balance in the spiritual battlefield, and the consequences are rippling across dimensions. But you've already won the critical war by refusing to fold under pressure. Now, the unseen is aligning with your truth, tipping the scales in your favor. You weren't just fighting for an inheritance. You were fighting for your soul and the souls that came before you. And in both realms you came out standing tall. Number 10. The ones who laughed in the beginning are lawyering up now. The ones who laughed first, the ones who scoffed at your struggle, dismissed your pain, and twisted your truth like a game, are scrambling now. Back then they acted like you were nothing more than a punchline, someone to be ignored or erased. They mocked the tears you shed, the quiet strength you held, and the fight you refused to quit. They gaslit you, made you question your own reality, and acted like your story was too small to matter. But here's the twist they never saw coming. They're the ones who are now running scared. Suddenly, they're the ones hiding behind layers of legal jargon, erasing messages, deleting evidence, and trying desperately to cover every trace of their wrongdoing. The laughter turned into whispers. The smirks turned into sweaty palms. Because justice, slow and steady, has finally turned its cold, unyielding gaze on them. They believed you were disposable, that you were a blip, a mistake they could sweep under the rug without consequence. But what they failed to realize is that you were never just anyone. You were chosen, divine, the kind of force that can't be silenced by ridicule or gaslighting. You were the storm they didn't predict, the reckoning they didn't prepare for. And now, all their arrogance is backfiring. Every joke they made at your expense, every cynical smirk, they're all fueling the fire that's burning their lies to ash. They underestimated you because they thought power was only about who shouts loudest or controls the narrative. But real power, the kind that breaks curses and changes destinies, is quieter, steadier, and far more dangerous. Now, while they're lawyering up and scrambling for cover, you're standing tall in the light of your victory. The ones who laughed in the beginning are paying the price for their blindness. And you're proof that what they mocked was actually the start of their downfall. Number 11. This inheritance triggered everyone who thought you were supposed to stay broke and grateful. You were never meant to rise. At least, that's what they wanted you to believe. The narrative they built around you was simple. Stay broke, stay quiet, stay grateful for whatever crumbs they tossed your way. They fed off that story like it was their security blanket. It kept you small, invisible, and easily controlled. Owning land, signing checks, leading others, those were privileges they thought were out of your reach, reserved for a different class, a different lineage. And you were supposed to accept that. But then you broke their spell. Winning this inheritance wasn't just about assets. It was a seismic shift that shattered decades of psychological chains. Suddenly, the carefully constructed illusion that you'd remain powerless was exposed as exactly what it was, an illusion. This victory screamed loud and clear. You're not confined by their rules, their doubts, or their limits. You stepped into a space they never thought you'd occupy, and that shook them to their core. Now the same people who once dismissed you see you as a real threat. Not because of the money itself, but because you broke the mental prison they relied on. Your success challenges the very foundation of their control. It threatens their ego, their sense of superiority, and their grip on the narrative they've been spinning for so long. So they respond with what they know best: legal battles, charges, and attempts to silence the disruption you represent. This is why the charges are loading. It's not just about money or property. It's about trying to neutralize a force they never expected to confront. They want to keep you small because in their world, your rise means their fall. But you've already proven they were wrong. You've taken what was denied to you, and in doing so, you've rewritten the rules. You're not just a beneficiary of an inheritance, you're a symbol of defiance, and that terrifies them more than anything else. Number 12. You bypassed their occult contracts just by existing in truth. Some battles aren't just fought with lawyers and documents. They're fought on a level most people don't see or want to admit exists. When you faced opposition in this inheritance case, you weren't just up against greedy relatives or crooked lawyers. You were up against a system entangled with dark forces, hidden deals made in shadows, contracts that were less legal and more occult. These weren't simple bribes or favors, they were curses disguised as clauses, rituals masquerading as signatures, and power plays backed by spiritual manipulation. They thought they had you trapped. They believed these hidden contracts, forged in darkness, would bind you and keep you from reclaiming what was rightfully yours. The wills, rewritten under secret influence, the legal favors bought through unholy pacts. These were the tools of a game they thought you couldn't win. But what they didn't count on was one thing: your truth. You showed up without fear, without masks, and without compromise. You walked into that courtroom and into the unseen fire with clean feet, untouched by their schemes. And that's when everything they'd built on lies, fear, and darkness began to crumble. Their so-called power was exposed as nothing more than smoke and mirrors. By existing in truth, you bypassed contracts they believed unbreakable. You disrupted the spiritual chains they counted on to control the outcome. Your presence was a living rebuke to their tactics, proof that no amount of dark influence can withstand the force of authenticity and justice. This wasn't just a legal victory, it was a spiritual exorcism. And now, everything they tried to build on deception is falling apart. You're not just the rightful heir in the eyes of the law, you're the one who broke the spell that kept the darkness in place. That's why their attacks are frantic and fierce, because your truth is the light that destroys their shadows. Number 13. They don't want the property back. They want your soul back in a cage. They'll talk about fairness like it's some noble cause, but that's just a mask. The battle isn't really over the house, the money, or the land. It's over you. What they're desperate to reclaim isn't a physical asset, it's control over your very being. They want to shove you back into survival mode, back into that corner where you're scrambling just to get by, afraid to shine and too busy fighting to breathe. Because when you're free, when you carry clarity and confidence, you become a threat they can't handle. You become a force that dismantles their hierarchy, that exposes their lies, that refuses to play by their rules. They know that a chosen one who's awake and unchained can topple empires built on manipulation and fear. That's why they're clawing so hard, not for what you own, but to cage your spirit once again. They want you dependent, doubtful, and disoriented. They want your energy drained by constant battles so you have no strength left to challenge them on deeper levels. Property and inheritance are just distractions to keep you focused on the surface. The real war is for your mind, your peace, your freedom to rise, but you're not theirs to control anymore. You've already broken free from the cage they built around you long ago. Every legal victory is a brick torn from those bars. Every truth spoken is a lock undone, and that terrifies them far more than losing a piece of land ever could. They're fighting for a ghost, the version of you they thought they could own. But that version is gone. You're walking in power, and no amount of threats or charges can hold a soul that refuses to be caged. They don't want your inheritance back. They want you back under their thumb. But you've already won the most important battle, reclaiming yourself. Number 14. You weren't just proving yourself, you were prosecuting the system that failed you. You weren't just fighting to prove your innocence or stake your claim. You were holding an entire corrupt system accountable. This wasn't a simple battle to protect what's yours. It was a bold move to shine a light on the rot that's been festering for generations. You didn't come to the courtroom just to defend yourself. You came to prosecute every hidden agenda, every silent betrayal, every twisted scheme that has kept the truth buried for years. The bloodline that thought it was untouchable suddenly found itself exposed. Their web of lies, carefully spun to keep you powerless, started unraveling thread by thread. Secret alliances meant to isolate you, inheritance plans designed to exclude you, and every manipulation meant to silence you were dragged into the harsh light of day. The entire system that was built on deception and greed was flipped upside down. And suddenly, the people who thought they held all the cards found themselves scrambling for cover. You didn't just win a case. You dismantled a dynasty of silence and corruption. And that's why the reaction is so fierce. It's not just about money or property anymore. It's about power, reputation, and legacy. You threatened everything they wanted to keep hidden, and now they're forced to confront the truth you unveiled. Your victory sent a shockwave through that entire network, shaking the foundations they relied on. It proved that no matter how deep the corruption runs, truth can still cut through. The courtroom wasn't just a place for judgment. It became the stage where you exposed a whole system built to keep people like you down. Now, everyone is scrambling under the weight of that exposure. Your fight wasn't just personal, it was revolutionary. And the ripple effects of your courage will be felt for generations to come. This wasn't just a victory in a courtroom, it was a seismic upheaval that shattered far more than legal documents. You didn't simply win an inheritance, you dismantled a deeply entrenched system built on greed, manipulation, and dark secrets. Every move you made exposed the lies that were carefully crafted to keep you small, silent, and powerless. You didn't just face down opposition, you stared into the abyss of generational curses, occult contracts, and shadowy alliances, and refused to blink. The charges they try to throw at you now aren't about reclaiming property. They're desperate attempts to cage your spirit, to keep you trapped in survival mode so you can never truly rise. But you've already broken those invisible chains. Your truth, your strength, and your unyielding presence became the force that crumbled their shadow kingdom. The courtroom was never their battlefield. It was their mirror, reflecting back every hidden motive, every twisted alliance, and every desperate fear. And you? You stood tall in that reflection, unshaken and victorious. This win carries the weight of generations, a breaking of bloodline curses, a refusal to inherit trauma and silence. You rewrote the narrative they wrote for you, proving that power is not given, it is taken, earned, and defended with relentless courage. The ones who mocked you in the beginning are now scrambling because they underestimated the force that you are. You were never just defending your rights. You were prosecuting an entire corrupt system that thrived on your suppression. What you've accomplished goes beyond the material. It's a spiritual reckoning that echoes in realms unseen. You've shown that purity of purpose and clarity of truth can disrupt the darkest schemes. You forced a system built on lies and manipulation to acknowledge your rightful place, not just as an heir, but as a warrior of justice. This is your moment, more than a legal win. It's a declaration that you are no longer bound by old rules, old fears, or old chains. You have reclaimed not only your inheritance, but your soul, your power, and your destiny. And while the battle may continue in different forms, one truth remains unshakable. You are the chosen one who won not just a case, but an entire legacy of freedom. If this message spoke to you, if you feel the power of breaking chains and reclaiming your destiny, then make sure you don't miss what's coming next. Hit that subscribe button and join this community of warriors who refuse to be silenced. Like the video to show your support. Leave a comment below sharing your story or thoughts, because your voice matters here. And don't keep this truth to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear it right now. Together, we're not just watching history, we're making it. Stay strong, stay sharp, and stay chosen.